Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 97. I am your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com, and we are excited to have with us the acclaimed and award-winning poet and author, Samantha Kolber. Samantha.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. How's things going this fine Tuesday night as of this recording?
It's pretty lovely. It's warmer than I thought it would be, actually. It's been pretty cold. Last night it was kind of chilly at night, but
right. Yeah.
It's still in August. I did see some leaves falling, so it's technically fall.
Not yet. Oh no. Okay. And they had, and so you're a poet. You're an author. You also do a lot. You're an established member, I guess, as well into the Vermont writing world, where you work at Rootstock Publishing. You work over at Bear Pond Books as well as the events organizer.
Yeah.
So you're surrounded by books all the time.
I am surrounded by books all the time, and I go to the library. I live less than a block away from the library. I'm right behind the library, so
really?
I'm there all the time. I wear many hats in the book world, and I kind of live books, like books. I'm a little obsessed. I've made the obsession into my life. So,
and you also get your MFA in writing, correct?
I did that through Goddard College. They have a low residency program, so you can do that, while you still work and have your other livelihood things going on, which is nice.
Right. Yeah, and Goddard's that's a beautiful campus too.
Yeah. Yep. So they have a sister campus in Port Townsend, Washington, and that's where I went for my
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's pretty cool.
It is pretty cool. Yeah.
And you just recently, this past year, you just published your book. And we just talked before you went on the air, a chap book.
It's a chap book. It's tiny. Look, it disappears when you turn it sideways. Tiny but mighty. That's what I said.
Tiny but mighty. Birth of a Daughter. And also too is that illustration, that cover illustration was drawn. That was designed as a watercolor painting of your 3-year-old daughter.
Yeah, so she's quite an artist. She loves to paint and do a lot of crafts. And when I asked her what this was called, she told me it was Mommy Monster. Which, I considered calling that the title of the book because it's kind of perfect. A lot of my poems, they're a little bit dark. They deal with like the underside of things we don't normally talk about. And so I thought, well, how astute. She's totally picking up. I guess I'm not being as cryptic as I thought. I'm not sitting around being a monster, but it's just kind of funny that I think emotionally she even could pick that up.
And you said, and also too, you said in a previous interview too that you had that you call your work dark but hopeful, your poetry.
Yeah, I think ultimately, when you're writing about anything dark or turning anything dark into art, the idea behind it is that you're turning it into art so that you can process it and live through it and heal through it. And everything is ultimately done with love. So even if it's from a dark place, there's always love behind it. So in my mind, it's light. It's light countering the dark, and the light for me is the writing, is the poetry.
Right. Yeah. And so how long did it take you to put together this chapbook anyway?
So interestingly enough, it's a weird process, right? Like I had all these poems. I actually have a full-length manuscript that I'd been shopping around for about a year, and it kept getting, passed over by publishers. It did come in like a semi-finalist in one of the prizes once, but
cool.
I just realized, okay, something has to change with this manuscript. Maybe it was just too big, or it wasn't tightly themed enough. It was kind of like a million poems. I mean, not a million poems. I think there were about 80 poems in that one. So I said, well, what kind of theme can I do here? And I write a lot about motherhood because it's such a part of my life. So I thought, well, maybe I called them the mommy poems. I said, maybe I'll take the mommy poems and put them together. And I do have 2 kids, but my daughter is 5. So she's kind of the closest. My son's 19. So I thought, well, what if I just did the birth poems and the poems around her? I've got pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, just like the early years. And I put those together, and it came out to be about, I think, 20 poems. And,
oh, wow.
Once I put them together, I thought, well, that's a chapbook. And and I did it chronologically for these because that makes sense for this story. But I didn't really sit down and say, now I'm going to write a chapbook of poems. I just kind of, I write poems sometimes as they come to me, or sometimes, I'll give myself an assignment and write a poem. But then I sit down and collect them and think, oh, now I have a lot of poems. Let's see if I can put them into a book. So that's what I did with this one.
And you mentioned too that in a previous interview that the birth of a daughter has dual meanings to it. It's one is the obviously giving birth to your daughter, but also kind of being reborn, as well as a sense of discovering yourself as a daughter as well.
Yeah. So something interesting, I think, happens when one becomes a mother and also a parent. I'm sure it's heavy for all people who become a parent. Your excuse me, your entire identity kind of shifts, right? Like now all of a sudden you're like this person's mother, you're this person's parent, and it's a whole new role and it's a whole new identity. And with that, you find yourself looking at all the roles and all the identities you've ever been. And so, yes, I've been a daughter, I'm an adult daughter, but with this experience, birthing my daughter, I don't have my mother alive anymore. And it suddenly became just a new way of looking at myself as, well, am I still somebody's daughter if I don't have my mother?
Right.
So there are some poems that look at what I call like the matrilineal lineage of being a daughter and birthing a daughter. There's so many traits that I see in my daughter that, I look at her and I'm like, oh, that's my mother. And little things like that.
Right. And so one of the points that I think that they brought up is like we have a lot of people that are authors or people that are writing a book and things like that. And because being involved in the writer's world, you also do some editing stuff. Where is the, because poetry is obviously different than writing long form fiction or nonfiction or something like that. Where do you see the role of an editor involved in poetry as compared to, say, like a long form book?
That's a great question. They are very different kinds of editing, and
Right.
I do some of both at Rootstock, but I am the poetry series editor, which means I not only edit the books, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I curate the series. I'm in charge of acquiring manuscripts and choosing the books that we want to publish in the poetry series at Rootstock. And then the editing part for poems, I've worked with poets who, maybe they have 100 poems and they say, here, I have a book. But when you look at those 100 poems, are they telling a story? Are they in a narrative arc that, makes sense as a book? Even though it's a book of poems, you still want to have a narrative arc. You want the reader to come away with a sense of story and a sense of place and a sense of narrative. So it's good to look at those poems and put them in an order that feels natural to the story of what the poems are trying to say. And I'm also a fan of culling down. I think as my time in the book, but the tighter the collection is, right? With poetry, more isn't always better. When you can get it pared down to the essence, it becomes a really powerful story. Right. So sometimes I'll work with poets to cut out poems. And then even within the poems, there's a lot of revision that has to go on for a poem to become a poem. There's many, many drafts, just like there are with longer forms of writing. And that could be, I'll be looking at a poem that I'm working with a poet, and maybe I highlight that the word snow was used, 6 times in a poem. And when you're having, a poem just has such a brevity of words. So every word is important. And unless it's part of the rhythm and the form of that poem, you might not need to repeat the same word, the word snow over and over again, right? So sometimes poets don't see that, and it's good to work with them to revise that, to find new words, to find fresh ways of saying things. Sometimes people will fall back on some cliche metaphors, and I'll work with poets to say it fresher, say it newer.
Right. And so have you ever been in a situation, either through your own poems or through editing and working with other poets, where they have to kind of rewrite the entire rhythm because there's too many redundancies in situations like that?
Oh yeah, a poem can start out one way and turn out a completely different way. I've done that with my own work. In fact, the poem in here that's called the missing poem, Birth. The reason it's called that was because when I was putting the book together, I realized I didn't have a poem just about the birth
Oh.
itself. So I was like, oh, now I have to write this. So when I wrote it, I wrote it out as just a narrative. It was more like a story. Like, it was very descriptive. You can really see the hospital room. You can hear the doctors and nurses. It was kind of like a story of her birth. And originally, that was how the manuscript was accepted for publication. But then the publisher said, you have a few months to really, hone your poems however you want to make sure all your poems are polished before we go to publication. And so I kept looking at that poem, and for me, I thought it was saying too much and it was too long. So I thought, oh, I'll just revise it a bit. And a bit turned into quite a lot of revising. I turned it into a completely different form. Before it had really big, chunky stanzas. And then it turned into, here, let me just open to the page. It turned into like an erasure poem, but then with white space. So now it looks like this. I don't know if the readers can see. It is too white.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see how it's just, oops, where does it go? I can't do things backwards. So it's just it's like a few words on the page now. I mean,
Right.
I would say I took out like 80% of the poem and left like these little chunks, little phrases. And it's a completely different poem, honestly. And sometimes I do that. I remember I had a poem, I think it's also in here. It started out as a sestina. Yes, it is in here. It started as a sestina, which is a specific form. It has a rhyming scheme, and the end words are very specific, and it repeats in this like 6-line way. And it just wasn't working. It wasn't working somehow. And I was working with my mentor at the time, Laurent Bosselar. She's a fantastic poet. And she said to me, maybe it's not a sestina. And I
Okay.
said, oh, what is it then? I was like, okay. And so I wrote it out, and then it came out more like a prose poem, and it has just some couplets in it that stayed in there. But it completely changed form. And that to me was funny, because I normally don't start with something as rigid as a sestina and then go to something freeform like a prose poem.
Mm.
I've done things the opposite, where I'll just have like a page of a journal entry, and then I'll say, oh, let's turn that into a sonnet, and you can go and pick out and plunk it into your little form. But yeah, poems change form all the time. It's very
Wow.
common and it's good to do that, because it's like having a canvas in your paint, and you want to try out different things. You might want to add more, color here, or take out color there. And so you really have to, and it's fun with poems. You can totally play with it. You can have, I can sometimes have 12 or more different versions of a poem. And I'm not talking about, I just took out one word, I'm talking about changing it from a sonnet to a sestina to a prose poem to something else. And
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. I didn't realize. I would just, as the end result, I just would always assume that you'd have to, you know, like, the poet would just like change some, synonyms or something, or just kind of,
Yeah.
but
I mean,
changing it. Wow. Okay. That's interesting.
sometimes that does happen. I do have many poems that kind of came out, I'd say, fully formed and just needed a little bit of tweaking.
Right.
But it just depends on the poem. It depends on what you're trying to say. It depends on how you're trying to say it.
Hmm. And you said, and I also said previously that you don't want to give away too much, and you don't want to be too abstract when it comes to poetry.
Yeah.
And is that another difference that poems have as compared to long form, where you have to be as descriptive? Like you have to, um, is there like a way to, like, you have to switch your thinking when you go from, like writing long form prose as compared to poetry?
Yeah. So it's different, because with fiction and long form, if you're writing a novel is comprised of scenes and action, right? So you want to put yourself, at least for me, when I'm writing fiction, I put myself in the character's place, and I'm kind of like in their world, in their head. And I'm kind of like, what are they seeing? What are they doing? How are they feeling? What are they tasting? What are they smelling? And I write a scene like that based on their actions and their feelings. A poem can do that sometimes, but a poem is a little different, because it's like a little piece of art with words, and it's
Right.
and it's often a feeling you're trying to evoke in the reader, or a feeling, that I have, and maybe I'm writing something because I'm really angry, right? I do a lot of anger poems. Those are fun. So, it comes out on the page and you're like, yeah. And then you tighten it up, and it's definitely a different way of thinking and writing, I'd say. Yeah.
Right. It's almost like you're interpreting something in a way when through that description. I guess. Now, and you also, because you remember this thing, so you physically write stuff out, right? Or you just go straight to the typewriter?
No, I'm a by hand person. I have
Okay.
a journal. I have.
Yeah.
Oh wait, I can show you one of the poems I recently did. So it's really fun to see, like this. I don't know if you can. Oh,
Yeah.
where's my camera? This
Yeah.
that turned into a poem of just like, short lines. So I often, journal, and I free write, or I just start out. Sometimes I just write down phrases or lines or snippets, and then I'll pull them out and type them up and find the shape once I'm typing them up.
Okay. Because you did, I mean, you said like, I don't know if you remember, you said this, is that you said it was like the words moving through your body. That's what you like, the physical act of writing it out.
Yeah.
And so from that sense of inspiration, when when you said like it's the words coming through your body, so do you feel as though it's like these are your ideas or your feelings, or is this coming from something else that you're just kind of like tapping into and putting it
I
down on
think there's
paper?
both. There's that whole like Jungian, um, the collective consciousness out there, right? And he had a whole thing about artists and poets really being tapped into that. And I have to say, it takes a certain kind of lifestyle to be able to tap into that, which, as a working mom, right? I have 2 kids, I have a puppy, I have a husband, I have 2 jobs. I'm not always just like, oh, my head's in the clouds and I can just be inspired all the time. Sometimes that happens and I feel like, oh, this is coming from another worldly space. But most often it doesn't. Most often I might be, like I said, really angry, and have to just journal and get something out. Sometimes I like to be in response to other things I'm reading. If I read something that really touches me, and then I'll kind of write my emotions around that, and then I might get a new poem from that. The poem in my chapbook, though, called Birth of a Daughter, that one did kind of come to me like a little lightning bolt of words when I was sitting outside. And as I wrote it, I was writing also the process. So in the poem, it says, I sit outside, I'm in the sun, I was like away from my daughter. She's at preschool. It's glorious to have this like free time. I was supposed to be working, but, but the words did kind of, I could almost feel them coming down like from the sky. And I had my journal there and my pen, so I was able to write them out.
And how much of it too, like as as compared to when you have to, like, as you mentioned before, like I didn't have something about the birthing, right? So how many of the poems that have you sat down and have written are based off of a subject you want to write about, and how much of it is, like you said, is just like pure inspiration?
Well, I mean, it's always something I want to write about. Otherwise,
Right.
I wouldn't write it. I
Yeah.
do love prompts. I like to write from prompts. A lot of people don't like that. They think
Okay.
it's too constricting. But if I love being in workshops, and if somebody
Right.
says, write a poem about, sparkles, glitter. I'm looking here. I've got my little glitter jar. Watch this.
Oh, that's cool.
I could probably look at this and just write about the galaxy. I don't know.
Right.
But I love stuff like that. And so I will. I think it helps me focus sometimes, or else I'm kind of like, there's so much going on and so much to write about. But I love prompts. There was, Bianca Stone. She's a fantastic poet, and she runs the Ruth Stone House. On Instagram one day, she put this poetry prompt, and it was a news article about how scientists were discovering like the DNA of 500 million year old sea monsters. Right. And so she goes, poets, you have to write a poem about this head, or use this headline as a title. but the poem is really about your mother, but don't say that it's about your mother, and end with a question.
Was that Rattle?
That, yeah. So
Okay.
that was the prompt. That was the I love stuff like that. So it's just a weird, let's take all this like chaos together and write about it. And I did. I was like, I can do this. I'm going to sit down and write this poem. And I journaled it out, and I was like, oh, that's weird. I thought it was very weird, and I didn't know it was actually going to be a poem. And I typed it out, and I was like, oh, I kind of like that. And then I sent it out to Rattle. They have this really cool Poets in the News. I think they call it Poets Respond.
Yeah.
And because it was about a news headline, I was like, oh, I can send this to them. It's weird, but we'll see. And they liked it, and they published it. Right. So, that to me, that poem never would have existed if not for Bianca and her and my, Instagram scrolling. I'm addicted to social media too much. But a good thing came out of it, right? I wrote a poem that day.
Right. And as you said, that you have other genres that you like, and I think you said before, I was kind of curious about this, is that you don't gravitate towards like the mystery novels. Is that what it was?
There's a couple that I like, but I don't normally like that as a, like the detective novels. That's never been my cup of tea. Right. Some of them I like. I do like literary thrillers, but I would say like, I don't read, Agatha Christie, and everybody loves Louise Penny, and Archer Mayer. He's got a really successful series about the
Joe Gunther.
Gunther.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that, and I'm like, okay, it's fun. There's a guy, and he's a detective, and he's solving some crimes. And I just never seem to get it, or it's just not where my heart is going. So I didn't.
Right. Is it? I'm curious. Is it based off of, because your style seems to be more of the it's like, you have the phrase of either, it's like you're writing, was it off the seat, or was it the pantsing or plotting?
Pantser, yeah.
Yeah. Is it because you think mystery novels are more of a plotters than pantser types? Because you can't really pants if you're going to write a mystery, I guess.
Yeah, I guess you can't. Except I love Jennifer McMahon's novels, and I don't know if you've ever read her work. There's usually a mystery element to that. There's always like a little plot twist. And I love those, but she also says that she doesn't always know where her writing is going, like where the story is going. Like she starts off with, there's a missing girl in the woods. Oh, let's go to the woods and figure this out. And then she kind of figures out the mystery as she writes it.
Oh, really?
It's really cool. So I guess she's a little bit, she's both. She's a pantser and a plotter, because she puts up pictures of her writing process where she'll have sticky notes like all over her wall, and she puts them around, like this scene goes here and this scene goes there, and and I think she might outline with her novels, but those I do like. And I guess I don't know if there's I think they're technically on the mystery shelves in the bookstore.
Really? Huh.
I do like some mysteries.
So as now that you've had a book published, and working on, as you say, you got many things many works in progress happening right now. What would be some advice that you would give somebody that hasn't published anything yet? And they're looking at, I don't know, where to start. That's like, Samantha, I got something going on here. What do I do next? Or what should I do with this? What would be some of the advice that you would give to writers?
It depends on the genre. If it's poetry, you'd want to start submitting to small publishers. You should also, before you ever publish a book or a chapbook, you should have poems published in journals, in literary journals, in reviews and anthologies. So you can take individual poems and submit that for publication. We've got the Green Mountains Review in Vermont. We also have Hunger Mountain online, which is through, and they do a print issue as well. That's through the Vermont College of Fine Arts. But nationally, there are thousands of literary journals. And so it's nice to start putting your work out there for publication, because the publisher will want to see those kinds of credits in your work. I think they usually like to see anywhere between, up to like 25% of the poems in your book have been published in other places.
Wow. Okay. And from that publishing perspective, what rights are, like, say, if you publish it in a magazine, do you still retain the rights to that poem, or does that belong to the magazine at that point?
You retain the rights. They call it like first rights. I forget the technical term, but when if you do publish it in a collection, you just have to credit that book. You would say, Birth of a Daughter published in the Literary Review, and just give it a little credit there. And then I think like after a year, or I don't remember how much time, I think it reverts like 100% rights back to you. But yeah.
Okay. All right. And do you know, and also too, is that you mentioned like how important would you tell an author that, hey, you know what? I know you've read your book. I know you read it a couple times. I know you did a draft, but send it to an editor. Would you?
Oh, it's huge. So, with my work at Rootstock Publishing, I mean, that's the first step. And we turn away a lot of manuscripts if we see that it needs more editing. Of course, we have professional editors on staff and we have proofreaders. But if it needs an edit that's instead of just like a copy edit or line edit, if it needs something more substantial, like developmental editing, we will turn away a manuscript and recommend they go work with an editor before it's ready to publish. And, like I was saying before, I finished a draft of a YA novel a couple months ago, and I was so excited I finished it. I thought, it's done, and I'm like, I'm a good editor. It looks perfect to me. And I did actually work with another developmental editor to help me with the structure of it, because it's a very complicated, like multi-point of view, multiverse kind of book. But I was so excited, and I sent it to an agent that was kind of waiting for it. And then she was like, I don't think it's really working. She's like, I'm not gonna take this on. And then I did get feedback from another agent of what to revise in it to make it better, which is great. I mean, having feedback and a starting point is great. But I'm just in this space where I got really deflated because I thought, oh, I'm done. And then I was like, and it's edited, it's great. But then I was like, oh, now it needs more editing. And it gets very disheartening. It's you have to have a lot of stamina and a lot of persistence to be in this writing business and to keep publishing books. I'm in this in between, just kind of not ready to dive back into the novel and fix it, even though I know that I think I'll get there. But yeah.
And how is it like? It's so interesting because it's a solitary job writing. You're by yourself, and then there's almost a point where you're like, all right, now I need to show it off, and then there's like immediate rejection on this needs to be fixed. Like how thick of a skin would someone's gonna send in it? What would be some of that advice from just like that emotional growth perspective that for authors to have to deal with?
I mean, you just have to roll with it. You have to believe in your work and keep going. I mean, there are, Pulitzer Prize winning authors that'll tell you this book got rejected, 62 times from, 62 agents or publishers, or it takes a lot of stamina. And while writing, like the act is a solitary act, it's great to have as much feedback and as many eyes on it as possible. So having being in a writer's group is a really great way to get that kind of feedback, or showing it to beta readers before the editors. Luckily I work in a bookstore, so I'm surrounded by people who love to read. So I got some colleagues to look at, to read it and give me feedback. All of my family, they're big readers. So my sister, my niece, my nephew, they all read it and gave me really helpful tips on how to work some things through. So, I mean, that's why when you read a book and you get to that acknowledgement section, it's not just like, oh, thanks myself, I did all this work. It's, it's thank you to all these hundreds of eyes, hundreds of readers and friends, family, editors, writing group buddies, all these people that help that book take shape.
Right. And how would you say, besides working at a bookshop, like how would you recommend, like, an author who's writing, it's like, how do I find these, your developmental editors and your line editors? Where do I find people to help me with this stuff?
There's a lot of things online. There's like a readz.com resource for writers, lots of resources. It's tricky because, you want to make sure you're getting like a what's the word? I just went blank. like a legitimate
Right.
editor. We have some fantastic people in this town of Montpelier, Vermont. Susanna Noel is an editor, and she runs the Editorial Arts Academy. So she actually trains people to be editors. So
Wow. Okay.
and she's just wonderful. We've been friends for a long time. So I texted her or emailed her and said, oh, I need an editor for my manuscript. Who do you recommend? Or even a beta reader. She helped me get in touch with another beta reader because I wanted somebody who I didn't know to read the book, right? Because when you're just having, your niece and your sister and your husband and your colleague, when you're having all your friends and family read your book, of course they could look at it critically, but they're also going to tell you, oh, it's great, or whatever. I wanted somebody who didn't know me at all to just read this thing and say, okay, what's working and what's not working, just from a reader's perspective, right? So I did find a beta reader that way. And I have to say, Twitter, it's like literary Twitter is just full of resources. I'm pretty sure that's where I got my developmental editor, Brandon Amico, and he's also a poet and he's an editor. I'm pretty sure, I don't know if he tweeted or somebody else tweeted about he was looking, he was open for manuscripts. He does developmental editing, and I was like, I have a manuscript, and so we had a consultation on the phone, and he sounded great, and he had this, he sent me over a contract. I said, looks good. There's a lot of resources over on Twitter, tons of writers, tons of people, and, supporting you on saying, that you can find advice. There are people who will post entire threads on how to write a query letter. And, and Rebecca Mackay, she's Pulitzer. Wait, did she win the Pulitzer, or was it a nominated? The Great Believers. I love that book. She also teaches. And so she wrote a whole thread on all of this feedback that she gives to her fiction students. And the entire thread, it was like taking a master class in revision. It was amazing. I mean, it was everything from cliche to, she had very specific things. She said she always sees people writing this lost Holocaust child story, and it just it repeats enough that it's become a cliche. And she had a whole thing about how to avoid the setup of the lost Holocaust child story. Yeah, I mean, you go on Twitter and everybody's tweeting. Oh, who is it? I think it was Ocean. Was it Ocean? That might have been Instagram. Ocean Vuong, a fabulous poet, had a whole thread about metaphor versus simile. And again, I was like, this is a master class. So
that's good.
Yeah.
So that would be so then the other question, obviously this might be a this question might be already kind of, I might know your answer to it already, be working at Rootstock Publishing, but what would you say is the pros and cons of self-publish versus looking for a publisher?
Self-publishing, you can just have all control over your work. You can do it yourself. You have to know a lot about how the publishing industry works.
Right.
You also still have to do all the editing or get an editor, proofreading, book design, book layout. It gets pretty technical laying out a book. You don't just, upload this Word document that you've been working on for 10 years, which sometimes takes that long. You don't just upload your Word document and now it's a book. Right. You have to have it laid out to very specific margin lines and measurements. So self-publishing can get tricky unless you're, usually you're hiring out for those skills. You're hiring a designer and an editor and a proofreader. So at Rootstock Publishing, it's kind of the best of both worlds because it's a hybrid publisher, which means that, the author has controlled 100% copyright of their work. They also have a higher royalty contract, so they get more net sales from their book sales than with a traditional publisher. But there's also a contribution that the author puts in to cover the work because, traditional publishers, not including the big five, but when we're talking about like indie publishers, they are often nonprofits and they get grant money. They get, National, Humanities Council, Endowment of the Arts money. So that's how they cover their production costs for doing the design and layout and editing and all that stuff. So, I would say if you really know what you're doing or can hire people to do it, self-publishing can be a great avenue. If you're not sure how to do that, hybrid publishers are a great choice. Traditional publishers will take a lot of time because, even once you write your book and it's edited and you've had all your beta readers and and you have your MFA in writing, and so it's a perfect book, you can get an agent and it could still, be on submission for, years before you get a contract with a publisher. And then there's another maybe 2, sometimes 3-year process through the publishing process. So it's a very long process. And that's fine if if that's your career path and that's what you want to do. But sometimes, at Rootstock, we see a lot of authors that maybe have a book project that they've worked on in their retirement. So they're not going to spend 7 years waiting for an agent and a publisher and all that stuff. So the hybrid option is a really good option for that.
Right. Yeah. And we had a few guests on the show that work through Rootstock as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Thank you for having them.
Oh, yeah. No. And so, so with that said, is there, as you say, you mentioned your prose, your young adult, your YA book that you're working on, is there sequel? Because this is it's the fun thing about, as you say, like, it's like the birth of the daughter. There's going to be more stories, there's going to be more poetry at 5 years old, 6 years old, so is there a sequel chapbook coming out soon?
So I do have another chapbook I put together. It's not about pregnancy or birth or my daughter.
Okay.
Sorry, we're not going to just, keep following her, but she does do cute things now that she's 5. This chapbook, I realize this is very kind of, motherhood centered and centered on my own mother and my mother-in-law. It's like the mother energy. So I realized, I have all these poems about my father. And so I put those together in their own chapbook. And that has been out on submission with publishers for a while. It came in as a finalist with one contest through Vermont College of Fine Arts. And I think it was a semifinalist with another place, but it didn't. But again, it's not getting picked up. So then I recently took those poems and what I call embedded it into like a full-length manuscript, where I made 3 chapters or 3 sections in the book. So I have, I have the part about my father and my childhood is in the middle, and is bookended by just other poems about me and my own identity. And then I have pandemic stuff at the end because, who didn't write pandemic poems this year? So I rounded that out because the chapbook about my father and my childhood was about, I think it was about this, like the same amount of poems, maybe 20 poems. And so I rounded it out. I have about 60 now. I think 60 pages. That to me is the full length collection. And I've just put that out to a couple places. So we'll see if that gets picked up.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's exciting stuff. And so does it also kind of fill in the Samantha Kolber theme of dark but hopeful too? Is that?
Yeah, they might be darker. Some of them are quite dark. I grew up in a household, we were middle class Jewish family in the suburbs of New Jersey. So on the outside, everything looked fine. But on the inside, there was a lot of chaos and there was a lot of abuse and neglect going on.
Yeah.
And, my father looms large as a figure in that. So there's a lot of poems that talk about that. But what I did was I took poems, I did persona poems in the voice of my father through text messages. So it's kind of funny-ish. I mean, it's funny to me. I have a very dark sense of humor. So I think that's pretty unique and original. But like I said, we'll see. I did have a publisher, I forget which one, but they rejected it, but they said how powerful the poems were and something about how they saw something in a new light that they hadn't seen before. Right. And I was like, that's the best feedback I've ever gotten, but you're not going to publish these poems. Like, what? Like, it didn't make any sense. Like it felt like it was like the nicest rejection I'd ever gotten because they really understood what the project was doing. Right. But then I was like, but they're not publishing them. I was like, damn. So yeah, we'll see if they get out there. But I feel like I'm working on a lot of things. I have, I always say I have like writer ADD, right? I've got my poems, I've got my YA, I've got like a middle grade book I started working on a while ago. Oh, I've got picture books that I've written, all these things. But
So what do you? So that's a good book, because these are different genres of books, like your YA and you get in your middle age, the picture books, poetry. So when you have, and I'm imagining you probably have a stack of journals, like you've been writing. So how do you determine what's written down there is going to, by what format are you going to utilize that idea or story seed?
yeah, so usually when I have an idea for a book, here, I'll show you. I get a special notebook for the book. I write like the little title of it. And of course, though, I try to have this with me and dedicated writing time and dedicate time to it where I write everything for that book in here. But sometimes I'll have them in other journals or scraps of paper. I've had things on napkins that I've had to transcribe. And then I got this one. This is another book, so I will get specific journals that I'll try to specifically write those in there. And, it works for me. Like I had like a few hours a few weeks ago and I thought, I really want to work on this new, well, actually it's not middle grade, it's YA. I think I think I put the middle grade away, but so I took this notebook to Hubbard Park and I just went for a little walk in the woods and took my notebook and took my pen and I sat on a log and I got into my little character's head. I thought, well, what is she thinking today? Let's write some backstory for her. And I just wrote a scene,
Right.
and I wrote a good, I don't know how many pages. I wrote some pages, and so eventually, oops, I dropped a book. Eventually you do that enough times and you have a book, it's just scene after scene.
Right. And you have to feel, almost like exercising in a way that you're just going to keep practicing that creative muscle to make sure that it doesn't deflate or anything as well.
Well, yeah, like I said, like I haven't written in that one for weeks because if I don't make the time, if I don't give myself the time to do that, then it will never get written. And the only reason the other YA novel got written was because I had spoken to an agent. I kind of did this thing backwards. I pitched a book before it was written, and you're not supposed to do that. But I was talking to her about another project already. But when I told her what this new book idea was about, she said, "That's great. I'll read that." And I said, "Oh, okay. I just have to write it." But I'd had this idea. Let's see, this was 2019. I'd had the idea for this novel for 6 years.
Wow.
It started in 2013. I was at the airport and I was just noticing how buried in iPhones everybody is, right? With their headphones and iPhone. And I know we're there now. I'm looking at an iPhone right now. But I just had this idea about technology and then what would happen if we decided it's like this dystopian apocalypse thing in the future. What would happen if we decided that in order for us to save nature, we actually needed more technology? Because instead of having paper books, everything is going to be digitized. And everybody says, well, that's better for the environment because you're saving paper and you're saving trees. And it became like this backwards dystopia. And I had this idea about this girl who was going to have to go on some journey to save the world. She has to prove that something's causing cancer. She has to,
Right.
And so I just wrote down the seeds for that like years ago. That was 2013. And I wrote it down and I thought, oh, I'll get to that book later. And then I just kept thinking about it, never got to it, and kept thinking about it. And then when I talked to this agent, I said, oh, well, I have this dystopia YA novel. And I explained to her what it was about. And she goes, oh my God, yeah, I want to read that. So I said, oh, I'll just write it. And then it took me, and that was September of 2019. It took me about a year to write that. And I just kind of, and I dedicated all of my free time to that because I wasn't really, I put the poetry aside, everything. I was like, I'm writing this book now. Yeah. So it's funny because when writers say, when you ask them how long it took them to write a book, and sometimes they'll say, oh, 8 years. But I think a lot of that, like technically this book took me like 8 years, but 6 of that was just, it was in my head.
Right.
And then when I finally got to the stage of, and I'd been taking notes because I did start a notebook for it a long time ago. I think in 2015, I started my notebook for it. And I had a few scenes here and there, and I had like a little outline of where I knew I wanted it to go. And then, of course, once I wrote it, other characters showed up that I hadn't planned on.
Right.
But some of them took over a little bit. Some, but it was really, because I'm not that plotter. It's not like I made the outline and said I'm going to write it just like that.
Right.
I think in terms of characters and worlds, like this one is a future world. So I was like, okay, what's this world really like? And it's scary because I, with going to that dark side, I guess you might call it. The best advice I ever got from my advisor in my MFA program was write what scares you.
Oh, okay.
Because that's where this fire is.
Right.
And so that's what I thought of with this world. I thought, well, what's the scariest thing I can think of? And I was like, well, technology is going to take over. There's going to be no more trees. Climate storms have ravaged everything. Species are dying off. Like it's really quite a ravaged earth. And so that's what I wrote.
And where do you find, because you mentioned earlier, 2 kids, 2 jobs, what would be the advice you would give to a writer to find the time to write?
It's really hard. I'm not one of those people who writes every day. Although I have lots of friends and I know other writers who will get up religiously at 5 a.m. And if you're on Twitter, it's called the 5 a.m. Writers Club. Hashtag 5 a.m. Writers Club. So if you can wake up at 5 and get a good 2 or 3 hours of writing in, maybe before the day starts, before the rest of the household wakes up, or before you have to go to your day job or school or wherever you're going. Right. So mornings could work. I like to have big chunks of time. And so I'm really lucky that my husband will sometimes give me like a weekend. Like he'll take the kid, because my other kid's a teenager, so he's off on his own. So he'll take the kid, to visit friends or family, for a weekend, or I'll go sometimes. His family also has a house in southern Vermont, not too far. So I can go to the house sometimes and have a weekend. And if I can get enough weekends, I can cobble together enough words. I kind of what I call I vomit words. Yeah. But also writing, all the time. Like for me, I always have a notebook next to me or with me in my bag wherever I am, especially if I'm walking in the woods. Walking for me is a huge inspiration and a huge way that kind of opens me up to seeing the story or feeling the words or whatever you want to call it. So, if I'm just going for a walk, which is nice because then you can get exercise and write at the same time. Yeah. But it's hard. Like when I was really writing this, the YA dystopia book, it was constantly in my head to the point where I was even on a run one time because I was like, still exercising. And I had to stop on my run because a scene came to me and I had to write it down, and I didn't have a notebook or a pen. So I had to type it out on the notes on my phone. And I was like panting. I remember I was on this dirt road and I'm like panting at the side of the road, just going and, and typing it out. And there's like a car going by. I'm like, no, I'm fine. So sometimes if you're in the story, you just write it whenever. Wow. But if it works for you to do that 5 a.m. daily routine, that's great. If not, try to carve out chunks of time. Maybe take yourself on writing retreats. There's lots of, the Vermont Studio Center offers writing retreats and scholarships. Lots of places you can hopefully carve a little space for yourself.
Wow, cool. Well, thank you very much, Samantha. And if people want to learn more about you and your work, they can go to samanthakolber.com, correct?
Yeah, and I have lots of audio there for my poems. And do I have video on there? I don't remember if I put video, but audio. I like to do audio of the poems because poetry is meant to be listened to as well as read. Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Samantha. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm really glad that we connected to get you on.
Yeah, thank you. This is fun. I love talking anything about books, writing them, editing them, publishing them, selling them at the bookstore.
Yeah, perfect. All right, and make sure you come back on when your other books are coming out too.
Oh, thanks. It might be a while. So thank you.
You're welcome. And did you see, like, as an author, when you, because I was just driving through Montpelier the other day, and of course the library always has that book sale, and
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
like I don't need another book, but I still go in and
You
I'll
always
spend
need
up.
another book.
I know, it's like I have the someday pile of the books that I'm gonna read. I'm like,
We call
all
those
right.
TBRs.
Yeah.
To be read.
Yeah. Okay. TBRs. I like
Yeah,
that. Okay.
it's called your
All right.
TBR pile.
All right. I'm gonna start saying that from now on. I like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.